This is a special report from NBC News. Here is Tom Brokaw.
Good morning, everyone. It now appears that in Moscow, Russian President Boris Yeltsin, backed by the Russian army, has firmly in control the White House, that is the Parliament building. Hundreds now of parliamentarians who were holed up inside have decided to surrender. This is the scene this morning just outside of the White House in the heart of the Russian capital. The army troops opened fire this morning at about 9:30 Russia time with heavy artillery from tanks. These uniformed people who are surrendering, we believe, are former members of the interior police who went over to the parliamentarian side during the fracas yesterday and the day before. They have now surrendered, but so far, no word on the fate of Alexander Rutskoy, who is the conservative vice president, and the Speaker of the Parliament, Ruslan Khasbulatov. Those are the two principal leaders of Yeltsin's opposition. He has regained control, obviously, of the situation, but at what price we cannot say now. Chaos in the heart of Russia for the past 2.5 days as the hardline opposition first broke out of the building and then seized the television building temporarily. And then, as you can see, this is the situation in Moscow. That's the White House. The new U.S. Embassy is just behind it there. The Kremlin is there, and the television center now back in the hands of the Yeltsin people. But it has been a bloody 48 hours in Russia indeed. The question is now, how does Boris Yeltsin put all of this back together? Just to give you a sense of what is going on there, Boris Yeltsin had dissolved the parliament, of course, because the hardline opposition within that body had refused to go along with his free market economy reforms. He called for new parliamentary elections in December. Those members of the parliament began to hole up in the White House building and saying that they wanted the president to stand for election at the same time he did. When he gave them a series of deadlines, that is, Yeltsin imposed deadlines on the parliament, they broke out over the weekend, breaking through a ring of police outside the White House, seized the television building, and began to run through the streets of Moscow. Yeltsin called in elite troops and heavy armor, and now he has the situation back under control, but it's a fragile hold indeed that he has on the Russian capital. We'll have continuing coverage of this very important story throughout the morning on this NBC station, and of course I'll see you tonight on NBC Nightly News with a complete wrap-up.
This has been an NBC News special report. This is a special report from NBC News. Here is Tom Brokaw.
Good morning, everyone. Russian President Boris Yeltsin, backed by troops and tanks, now has regained control of the capital city of Russia, Moscow. Hundreds of people have surrendered from inside the White House, that's the Parliament building, where Yeltsin's hardline opposition has been holed up after a bloody weekend of fighting at several locations in Moscow. Earlier claims that some 500 may have been killed inside the White House now are said to be exaggerated. How many died, we cannot say, nor do we know the exact location at this hour of Vice President Rutskoy or Parliament Speaker Khasbulatov, who are the two principal opponents of Boris Yeltsin. We do not know whether they are in custody or whether they are negotiating the terms of their surrender. Standing by now, where it is coming on in early evening, is NBC News. Is it a lot quieter now, Rick?
Yeah, Tom, it is. A heavy late afternoon artillery assault on the Russian parliament seemed to convince even the most die-hard defenders and fanatics of Yeltsin that it was time to quit, to just give up. The slow trickle of men coming out under white flags turned into long lines. The 300 included rebel members of parliament, their supporters, and the ragtag militia trying to protect them. They had suffered much. There were big losses, mostly among that poorly armed militia. It was an uneven fight here from the very first moments of the attack early this morning until the very end. After Boris Yeltsin declared a state of emergency, he brought in the big artillery, the heavy guns, the T-72 tanks. Brought in the tough men, commandos. No one took a step back, unlike the retreat yesterday under fire by the police as soon as the rebel forces launched their attack and took control of the area. Boris Yeltsin had hesitated to use his military muscle through this until the political revolt turned into a violent revolt. Then he used every bit of muscle he had, and it was effective today, Tom.
Rick, can you give us a sense of what the people on the streets of Moscow are saying about all this?
Tom, we spoke to people today on the streets who said they favored what Boris Yeltsin did, but some said they still didn't think he was a Democrat, and many said that they didn't care who won this fight because they didn't have much confidence in any of the politicians. They were made a lot of promises at the end of communism that things were going to get better, and so far, for most of the people here, except the very wealthy, things have gotten a lot worse. There does not seem to be that wonderful, euphoric support for Boris Yeltsin that once existed in this country.
And the White House, the Parliament building, is not too far from some hotels that cater to Western businessmen. What's the security in that area?
There's been heavy security around that area all through the day and also around the U.S. Embassy. We heard a few of the tourists today and the businessmen saying, well, maybe we should try to catch the first flight out. They had been impressed with this country up until now because they only see the rich side of it. But I think after today they see this as a rather troubled country. They may be a little more hesitant to do some business here, or they may want to make sure that Boris Yeltsin is really controlled before they pour any more money and investment in this place. It's been an extremely violent time.
Thank you very much, Rick Davis. We'll ask you to stand by there in Moscow. We want to go on the telephone now to the American ambassador to Moscow, Thomas Pickering, who's been monitoring all of these events very carefully, of course. Mr. Ambassador, tell us what your evaluation of the situation in Moscow is right now.
Tom, I think we're getting close to what we hope will be the wind-up of the government return of the Parliament building to their hands. We've seen, as you have, a number of people come out all day. The government has made it clear to me that they plan to do this in steps and stages and very carefully, and they want to get as many people out through that process as they can without shooting, without killing. It's a very difficult problem and a very tough decision, and obviously something that Boris Yeltsin all along has tried to avoid, but has now been thrown into the midst of it by the events of yesterday, the absolute reign of lawlessness that took hold here yesterday afternoon and evening.
Mr. Ambassador, I don't know whether you could hear Rick Davis or not, but he was talking about Western businessmen who were running for the airport trying to get out of town because of the turmoil on the streets. Isn't this going to set Russia back considerably in terms of Western economic investment in that country?
Well, frankly, Tom, I've just been out. I think that under any circumstances of this sort, some people will go. Most of Moscow has been going about business as usual. I've had two very important delegations here meeting with their Russian counterparts and key issues that have to be dealt with. Other parts of the city, and I've been in touch with my people all over the city who have not come into the embassy, seems to be calm. Children going to school, workaday activities going on as usual.
All right, Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much. We hope to see you tonight on NBC Nightly News for an update at that time as well. We want to go back now to NBC's Rick developments for us. Rick, what's the story?
Tom, we have now had a report that Vice President Ruskoy has surrendered, that he is among those hundreds who have now left the building and realized the fight is over. Earlier today, he said he only wanted a ceasefire and was not willing to surrender, but Boris Yeltsin seemed to be saying that he wanted an unconditional surrender. We do not know the terms under which Ruskoy has left the building.
Ruskoy, of course, was the former Russian military hero in Afghanistan, who for a time was aligned with Boris Yeltsin and then went across the line. Thank you very much, Rick Davis. We'll ask you to stand by for any updates that we'll need from Moscow. We're going to go now to San Francisco. NBC White House correspondent Andrea Mitchell has been traveling with President Clinton, who conducted a town hall last night on his health care plan, but of course, many of the questions, many of the concerns about Russia. What's the evaluation of the White House this morning, Andrea?
Well, the White House is relieved that Yeltsin has retained control and regained control of the Parliament building. It is a very high-risk strategy for the White House, for this administration, but they feel that they had no alternative but to stick with Yeltsin, as have all other Western leaders. The president was briefed before he went to bed last night in his town hall meeting. As you pointed out, the very first question was about Russia, and he said that he felt that Boris Yeltsin had bent over backwards to avoid having the soldiers fire on the Parliament building, and that in fact, according to Mr. Clinton, perhaps Yeltsin feels that he went too far in avoiding taking that Parliament building back because the opponents, the rebels, were able to build up a head of steam, and things got out of control yesterday. So it was a very sympathetic Bill Clinton to Boris Yeltsin. He has not been in touch with Yeltsin personally, at least not as of this moment, as far as we know, but the White House, the administration, is entirely in Boris Yeltsin's corner. After all, he is the only horse that they can ride.
Andrea, any plans to provide additional economic assistance of any kind to Russia?
At this point, no. The president has discretion to use the funds that have already been appropriated, and I think that he will do that. What they're going to want to see from Boris Yeltsin is a very rapid move towards the free elections, that everything is moving ahead on that track to get over this obvious problem of having moved against the constitutional guarantees and having moved with violence against violence. So they're going to try and hope that Yeltsin will try him to move very quickly towards the elections and towards the economic reforms. I thought it was very interesting that when the violence first broke out yesterday at the television station, it was the Vice Premier Gaidar, who is, of course, well known in Washington as a top economic reformer, who took to the television airwaves in Moscow. He is well known because he was leading the reform. He was forced out and then replaced, put back into the government just a few weeks ago. So the administration is very hopeful that these reformers will take hold.
Andrea Mitchell in San Francisco with President Clinton. Thanks very much. At the Pentagon now, NBC Pentagon correspondent Ed Rabel. Ed, a couple of other developments in other parts of the world today as well. What's going on in Somalia now?
Tom, we've learned that the elite Army Rangers have taken a terrible beating there. Perhaps double the number of killed and wounded that have been reported, perhaps 10 killed, 20 scores wounded. In addition to that, a number of the Army elite Rangers is missing and presumed to be held captive. At least one of the Rangers appears on a distributed by the captors. Consequently, we've learned that expected to deploy hundreds of more forces to Somalia, special commando forces, special operations forces, and heavy armor. Right now, forces in Somalia are without armor, and they need the M1A1 main battle tank of the United States, plus the Bradley fighting vehicles to do the job there.
Ed, just review for us how the Rangers got involved in this fight. Was this another operation against Muhammad Adi, the warlord?
And with a command-detonated mine that hit a Jeep, and 3 Americans were wounded. Then there was another operation after that to try to capture some of Adid's close lieutenants. That did happen, and then 70 Rangers had to be deployed to try to come to the rescue of those who came under fire who had captured Adid supporters, and that was when a couple of U.S. Army Black Hawk helicopters were shot down.
All right, thanks very much, Ed Rabel at the Pentagon. We just want to show you what has been going on after that update on Somalia, what has been going on in the streets of Moscow today. It does appear that Boris Yeltsin has regained control. We've heard from Rick Davis that Vice President Rutske now has surrendered. Also, a reminder that on the West Coast, the Today program will continue. And for the rest of the country, we'll have continuing updates on this and other situations on this NBC station.
This has been an NBC News special report.